Hi folks, Dr. Pulsifer here to apply some lessons of history to a current situation and perhaps provide some illumination for designers of war games or diplomatic games. So the subject is that peace negotiations don't always turn out well, and sometimes they're inherently hopeless. In this case, there's been a lot of talk about negotiations to end the Ukraine war soon. Too many people can't remember the Cold War when we were much more under Russian threat than we are now, and they're terrified by Russian nuclear blackmail. They wishfully think, quote unquote, that peace is a quick option, and they don't much care what else happens as long as the threat of nuclear war is removed. But of course, if the Russians succeed in their goal, which is to eradicate Ukraine, then that nuclear blackmail option won't be removed. It'll just be applied elsewhere. So, given Russia's goal, I don't see any way peace talks can succeed in the long run, even with Trumpian manipulation. If there is a peace, it won't last unless the Russians are left prostrate. Nor will we see normal relations reestablished with Russia in this generation. This is the second Cold War, folks. This is not, oh, we just need to end this fighting and everything will be back the way it was. Golda Meir, who was Israeli prime minister long ago, said, you can't negotiate with someone who has come to kill you. And John Fitzgerald Kennedy said, we cannot negotiate with people who say, what's mine is mine and what's yours is negotiable. And he was talking about Russia, of course. And the same is true now as when those folks said those things. Well, this topic is important for some historical games about warfare, especially prolonged wars. Sometimes also for multi-sided games involving diplomacy and negotiation. So, background. In warfare, my view of diplomats and political scientists is diplomats think everything will work out as long as a ceasefire can be arranged. They focus on the ceasefire and not on what comes after. Political scientists, on the other hand, are convinced there is always some deal that will be acceptable to all sides. Kind of lines on maps epitomizes this. But often the diplomatic view is not correct, and sometimes the second, the political science view is not correct. I'm an historian, on the other hand, and historians tend to focus on what actually is and what actually happens. Ceasefires sometimes work, or at least partially work. For example, the Korean War, the 1953 ceasefire did the trick. Neither side wanted to expend the resources that might be required to conquer their Korean enemy, so there was a deal to be made, although it took a couple years of stalemate and slaughter before that armistice was reached. And yet there has never been a peace treaty to this day, only that armistice. On the other hand, in World War I, the ceasefire amounted to the surrender of Germany, with Germany's allies already surrendered or in dissolution. Historically, typically after initial ceasefire, a treaty was negotiated that resulted in an end to the war, as in World War I, but that's because the sides had already more or less agreed that there would be a treaty and what the basic provisions would be before the ceasefire. Now, an example where there was no solution, think of World War II. Both the Germans and the Japanese were required to surrender initially, virtually unconditionally, although Japan was allowed to keep their emperor. There was no temporary ceasefire or other solution available. In big wars, you don't have temporary ceasefires in general. Italy, on the other hand, more or less surrendered in 1943. World War I isn't as clear because we lack the ideological impetus of World War II. But in the end, the war went on until one side could no longer fight, and parts had already surrendered. Now, you can also think about wars where there was a peace of as long as several years, and then the war continued to a conclusion. And that could happen in Ukraine, but it's a bad idea for the West because it'll just enable the Russians to rearm and attack again. In the Peloponnesian War, there was a gap where there was peace. In the wars between Napoleon and his opponents, there was a peace of a few years. But that was not a lasting peace. That was a temporary peace. Now, wars are almost never to the death of everyone, though in one of the South American wars, 3/4 of the adult population of Paraguay, adult male population, was killed. But wars can be to utter exhaustion when one side can no longer fight. This is what is happening in Ukraine, and the Russians seem to be on the edge. They're in big trouble, although the mainstream media doesn't seem to recognize it. And of course, we have examples like in World War I. The Russians, the socialist government, which overthrew the Tsar, had to give up against the Germans in 1917. And when the Bolsheviks overthrew the socialists, then the Bolsheviks also had to give up. They just couldn't fight the Germans anymore. And the Germans acquired large swaths of Russia and then continued their fight with the West. On the other hand, we have the Arabs who tried to fight to the death with Israel, and to this day, the Palestinians want the Israelis wiped out, exterminated, but they failed utterly. The Roman Republic seceded because they refused to lose, and finally their opponents gave up. For example, in the First Punic War with Carthage, the Romans and the Carthaginians were both exhausted, and a private subscription, donations from private citizens, was used to build the final fleet that finally brought Rome victory. In the war with Hannibal and Carthage, the Second Punic War, the Romans refused to lose, and finally they were able to defeat even Hannibal. Of course, the Romans also enjoyed superior manpower. This is one of the things the Russians traditionally have done, is rely on superior manpower to defeat their enemy, even if it takes a long time and if they get slaughtered in the meantime, simply because they have more people. The Peloponnesian War went on until Athens could no longer fight, done in by Persian subsidies to their enemies. The Paraguayans that I mentioned fought on until most of their adult males were dead, and they still lost. So refusing to lose doesn't always work. So if we want to sum this up, diplomats and political scientists both want or think ceasefire is possible and can lead to peace, but sometimes that's just not true. Ukraine is one such example. Though I think the Europeans can be sufficient support for Ukraine to fight on to Russian dissolution, even if Trump foolishly withdraws American aid permanently. Always keep in mind, Trump doesn't care what happens after the ceasefire. He doesn't care what happens to other people. He just wants a Nobel Peace Prize like his nemesis, Obama, who was awarded one in 2009. Don't pay attention to mainstream media. They sensationalize everything and are quite often wrong. Thanks for listening.